Restoring men in history, great one for the guys, one of the most famous battles of all time and one of the most significant and important for America and George Washington. His men, George Washington, the Battle of Trenton and how it changed America and the world. George Washington, I loved always. I've read a bunch of biographies on him. This is one of my favorite biographies, so we're just going to mention it. But I've also read the primary source from a guy on the field that day that was there with Washington. So we're going to go through chapter 23 of Ron Chernow's Washington, a Life. It's a magnificent book. I recommend it. I think you'll enjoy it. I've read a bunch, and they're all good, and I could recommend some others. But since we're taking from his chapter, we'll just recommend his today. Again, this battle changed the world. What did it? Virtues, the virtues of Washington. He led from the front. How many battle commanders do that? And he was a great battlefield commander. He led from the front and took risk. He didn't ask his men to take risk he was not willing to take. That's a great commander. That's a guy you want to follow and be behind, right? A guy who leads from the front, isn't afraid to take risks, and will put his life on the line. And by the way, he didn't have to do it. Richest man in Virginia, but what did he want? Liberty, like Patrick Henry. Independence for you, for us. And his win, by the way, his troops were beleaguered, hungry, starving, didn't have shoes, didn't have clothes. It was a terrible situation, and the enlistments were coming up. So a lot's on the line here for what morale was low, finances bad, everything bad, bad, bad. So at that choice in life, as you men know, you have a choice in life. You can go forward or you can quit. Washington never quit. He kept going on through the pain and the sacrifice, and he was a sacrificial man, willing to sacrifice his wealth and estate and everything for the cause, the American cause. So let's go over to Ron Chernow's Washington, a Life. So we're going to read just a little bit of The Crossing, chapter 23, Ron Chernow, Washington, a Life. And what happened here? One of the things that was going on, and the prelude's really important. Some of these stories are great that Ron Chernow tells, and I've read in other books as well. Hey, Washington right away was disappointed. What was he disappointed in? British were strategic, and they were doing this loyalty oath, and there were a lot of loyalists in America, right? So he thought a lot of the New Jersey militia would come over, join his forces, but they didn't. They ended up, a lot of them taking loyalty oaths to the British, and that was a good strategic move by the British. And he says this, but in this I was cruelly disappointed, he informed Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull. The inhabitants of this state, either from fear or disaffection, will to a man, almost to a man, refuse to turn out. So we're already, he was down to what we talked about at the earlier point in the opening. Men were hungry, barely had clothes. He was up against the wall. He had a raggedy band of a few thousand men, Ron Chernow says. He went across New Jersey. They'd worn out their shoes. During the journey, by the way, they were skinning hides, taking down cattle, wrapping crude sections around their feet. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's some tough, resilient men. And along with Washington, I want to point out, these men were resilient because they didn't have to go on. They could have quit. Washington didn't quit. They didn't quit. It's kind of an American spirit. We don't quit as Americans. How long did it take to get over? Because they're going to cross it again in a bit. You're going to hear that story for the Battle of Trenton. 5 days it took to get the men over. 5 days to cross the Delaware River into Pennsylvania near Trenton. Now, there's a great story from Charles Willson Peale. He had painted a younger and happier Washington, and he now served in the Pennsylvania militia. He said, studying this grand but dreadful sight, Peale noted the hazardous drudgery of ferrying horses and artillery across the water. He characterized it as the most hellish scene I ever beheld. And he told this story. He's watching these soldiers pass by him, and they just looked horrific and awful. Beleaguered, undressed, unclothed. And they looked terrible. And a man staggered out of line and came toward me, he said. He'd lost all his clothes. He was in an old dirty blanket jacket, his beard long and his face full of sores. It so disfigured him that he was not known. I couldn't recognize him at first sight. Only when he spoke, when he spoke, did I recognize him. You know who it was? It was his brother. And only when he spoke did I recognize him. Now, Washington told men to look around for boats. They found these Durham boats, barge-like craft, 60 feet in length. They were usually used to carry iron ore and other freight. But they were good in inclement weather, and we're going to have that here in a minute. On December 8th, General Howe, British general, and his army arrived in Trenton. They exchanged fire with American troops on the Delaware. 12,000 men Howe had. He was tempted to snatch Philadelphia, but in true aristocratic style, he retreated to New York to have fun in New York City. But behind, he left 3 Hessian regiments under Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about, I've read a little bit about Johann Gottlieb Rahl. He was supposedly a weather-beaten, good military commander, very experienced, a veteran, and very good at leading men and very courageous. And these Hessian soldiers were supposedly very good soldiers, according to some historians. But Howe was feeling good that the tide had turned, the British were going to win, and all this was going to go away. New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island were all going well. On December 13, Congress abandoned the city, and they went to Baltimore. So they left Philadelphia. Now, at this time, when you're so beleaguered and down, men have a choice. They can quit or they can go on. The troops are in bad shape. They're hungry. They're starving, many of them. So he could have sat around dwelling, right? We can ruminate. Men can either ruminate or they can think and take action. Which did Washington do? Washington thought there might be an opportunity here. He thought this cold snap in December, and he had fears the Delaware might freeze over and the British might attack him. So he began to think more creatively. He had despair, which unleashed, Chernow says, his aggressive instincts and opened his mind to unorthodox tactics. Now, normally, Washington had been a defensive commander. But right now, he's going to change that and be aggressive. I'm telling you, this battle changed history and the world. On December 14th, he predicted to Governor Trumbull that, quote, a lucky blow against the British would most certainly rouse the spirits of the people. And he knew he had to do that. He knew the people were down too, not just the men. And that he needed to do something to rouse the spirits. You know, in wars, a lot of the public spirit is so important of your people wanting to go on and continue the war. And remember, enlistments were about to come due. So he had kind of this urgency to get something accomplished. Now, he thought they were hovering around ready to attack him across the Delaware, the British. He was worried about that. He warned his brother Samuel, quote, I think the game is pretty near up. He was worried about the decaying support at home. We are all of opinion, my dear General, Joseph Reed told him, that something must be attempted to revive our expiring credit, give our cause some degree of reputation, and prevent a total depreciation of the continental money. Remember, money's important in a war. So, hungry, men unclothed, financial problems. Washington had about everything going against him. Enlistments coming that were going to not be, he wasn't going to have any more men. They were going to flee and go off. They didn't have to stay. And Washington understood public opinion. He knew it was important. By December 22nd, Washington's army had been bolstered by regiments that had previously marched under Charles Lee and Horatio Gates, boosting its strength to more than 7,600 men. But remember, the enlistments are coming due, and he's going to lose those men. So he had about 10 days to get a victory against the British. Otherwise, his troops would be gone. That's a lot of pressure for a commander to know your men are gone. Now, some reports were given to the Hessians, but one Hessian said this: we did not have any idea of such a thing, and thought the rebels were unable to do so. A timely spur to patriot spirits was the publication of a soul-stirring manifesto by Thomas Paine. We've gone over Thomas Paine. He wrote 13 essays. We've read for some of them. The Crisis. Now, Washington handed these out, and this is pretty amazing, on December 23rd. And it's amazing that it's at Christmas, right, that he's going to do all this, the Christmas season. He handed out the Crisis around December 23rd. Washington had the men read out loud in small clusters of men around fires. And they glow with pride, Chernow says. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. And I think that holds true today. What we do when emergencies come, what we do when our country is in crazy trouble. Payne said this: Voltaire has remarked that King William never appeared to full advantage but in difficulties and in action. The same remark may be made on General Washington, for the character fits him. Washington and his generals decided to cross on Christmas Day. What about that? And pounce upon the Hessian garrison. They'd go in the night of Christmas Day. For heaven's sakes, Washington said, keep this to yourself, he told Joseph Reed on December 23rd, as the discovery of it may prove fatal to us. On December 24th, Colonel William Tudor explained to his fiancée in Boston why he stayed with the little crew gathered on the Delaware. He said this: I cannot desert a man who has deserted everything to defend his country, and whose chief misfortune is that a large part of it once lacked spirit to defend it. Now here's the question. Washington had the spirit then. Patrick Henry had the spirit. Do we have that spirit today? Because our country faces enormous problems, deficits, problems at the border. So who are the men who are going to rise? It's not going to be probably come from Washington. It's going to have to be us. And men are going to have to rise to meet this challenge to save the greatest country the world has ever known, America. So we have to make a choice. Stand against the debt and the deficits in a peaceful and lawful way. Washington knew this would be it. That it would be calamitous or very successful. Now here's a great story. Dr. Benjamin Rush, he's with Washington before all this takes place. While I was talking to him, I observed Washington was playing with his pen and ink. And upon several small pieces of paper, one of them, by accident, fell upon the floor near my feet. I was struck with the inscription upon it. It was victory or death. And I think that pretty much sums up the operation. For Americans, it was victory or death. That was also the password of the secret operation. On the cold Christmas Eve of 1776, Washington convened and he met with his officers. And he said, can we do it? After a 5-day ordeal, remember it took 5 days to cross, he now wants to do it in a day. And they were skeptical. They said, can we really do this? Can we move this army and artillery across in one night? You might say, only with divine intervention could they do that. So this plan had to go and be executed pretty perfectly, they thought, to accomplish it. But Colonel John Glover, I've read about this guy several times, he reassured not to be troubled about that, as his boys could manage it. Pretty confident, this colonel. So you can see the men who helped make this a success. And many books say Colonel John Glover was a key getting the men across. Main force of 2,400 men, along which Henry Knox and his artillery would cross. That's an undertaking to move that much artillery across in one evening. Crossing Delaware at McConkey's Ferry, 9 miles above the Trenton. 9 miles above Trenton. Once across the river, this force would split into two columns, one marching under General Sullivan along a road hugging the river, and the second farther inland along the higher Pennington Road to be guided by Washington and Greene. Then they would rendezvous. Further downstream, 700 militia led by General James Irwin would cross the river directly at Trenton, while 1,500 troops would cross at Bristol under Colonel John Cadwalader. All right, so they had 4 shots to get there, right? 4 shots. Christmas Day, 1776, dawn. Cold but sunny, Chernow says. It didn't go as fast as they wanted. It wasn't very rapid. It moved much slower, and a lot of times in these military engagements, you'll see your plans don't go like you want them to, so you have to adapt. But the men did get across the Delaware. Once they got across the Delaware, they needed to go 9 miles in pitch darkness, and that's difficult to march in pitch darkness. They needed to arrive by, Washington wanted them to arrive by 5 a.m. Here's another good story. Legend depicts him shrouded in a cloak against the biting wind, sitting perched on an empty beehive, barking orders at Knox. They said Knox and his voice bellowed across the waterway and helped get them across. Washington never asked his men to take risk he would not take. That's a great leader. Chernow writes that chunks of ice traveled swiftly down the Delaware. The question was asked, who will lead us? Again, Washington asked John Glover and his stout-hearted fishermen said, "We'll get it done." As often was the case, and this is true, I've read a lot of biographies on him, Washington attained his greatest nobility at the times of crisis. His Excellency George Washington never appeared to so much advantage as in the hour of distress, wrote Greene. And that's true. He does have this knack through history from the French and Indian War on in coming through. Also in avoiding death. He actually could have and should have been killed many times going back to the French and Indian War. I think it's divine intervention, I really do, with Washington. 2,400 men boarded the Durham boats to begin their 800-foot journey across the river. Tightly wedged in, 40 standing men were sometimes squeezed into a single craft, Chernow says. They were transporting horses and artillery guns, and get this, nearly 400 tons of cumbersome artillery on those Delaware ferries. Rain, sleet, wind soaked everything. The storm retarded troop movements, and it was jeopardizing the entire plan. Washington had fears they wouldn't make it by the time that they had to hit them at daybreak. Despite the delays, Washington, and here's where you can do this, guys. Things are going to go wrong. You're going to have an adversity. What's going to happen? You're going to have to make a decision. Do you go on or do you stop? Things were not going correctly in the way it was planned. At this point, Washington could have decided to give up or go on. What does he do? He's decisive. He goes on. He decides to go on. And he also thought if they retreated, they'd be harassed and discovered. They were supposed to get across by midnight. They didn't get there till 3 a.m. Also, the other two forces, invading forces, didn't make it. They had been canceled due to an inability to pierce icy masses. So Colonel Cadwalader couldn't get across his artillery. And he had assumed Washington had canceled the plans because the weather was so bad. So think about it. The weather's so bad that Colonel Cadwalader thinks the mission's over, that it's aborted. Washington keeps going on. Cadwalader stopped. Okay, now once they're hiking back through there, the road winding through the woods was steep and treacherous. Snow, sleet, hell. Think of the conditions these men are going through, and they got to go on. So it's not just Washington. These men have resilience, and they're going on. Can you go on when everything's opposed to you, when you have every adversity and everything's at you? At a place called Jacob's Creek, and this is an amazing story too. I love these stories about Washington. He's just so fantastic. I love Washington. At a place called Jacob's Creek, the soldiers had to execute the risky maneuver of rolling artillery. On horseback, Washington was directing their movements when the hind legs of the horse buckled and began to skid down the icy covered slope. His men, and he was known to be this, then saw the greatest horseman of his age perform something magnificent. Twining his fingers through the horse's mane, Washington yanked its large head upward with all his might. At the same time, he rocked and shifted his weight backward in his saddle until the horse regained its equilibrium. The amazing feat happened in the blink of an eye, and the artillery continued. Washington did it. He was the right man at the right time. Think if he hadn't been a great horseman. They said he was the best in some books. Greatest horseman of all. He was also supposed to be this magnificent dancer. He was good at many things. But it wasn't going as planned. His army was only halfway to Trenton when the first sunlight wanly colored the sky at 6 a.m. Not good. Not what Washington wanted. He wanted to be there earlier. What do you go on? He again held another conference. Hey, we got to make a decision. Are we going to go on? We're behind schedule. This is where you have to be decisive and make decisions constantly. Adapt as a commander. Washington met with them, said, let's go on. They all decided, let's go on. Taking the upper Pennington Road with Greene, Washington chose the more arduous route. That's a great commander. He took the harder route, taking the bigger risk himself. I mean, every time I read a biography on George Washington, I gain more and more respect for him. What a great man. Now, here comes a message. A messenger from Sullivan informed Washington that his men's sodden weapons were now useless. You know what George Washington said? Tell the men to use the bayonet. Great line, right? Great line. This is a great story. Chernow does such a good job with this story. At around 7:30 a.m., the operation was nearly derailed by a blunder committed by an old Washington colleague, General Adam Stephen. Now get what happens here. There's another thing that could have just blown up the whole operation. Hear this story. That general had dispatched a company of Virginians to scout enemy positions at Trenton. Washington was shocked to meet 50 Virginians and learn that they had exchanged fire. That could have blown up the whole thing. Captain George Wallace told Washington they had acted under instruction from Stephen. Washington hauled the latter into his presence and said, you, sir, may have ruined all my plans by having put them on their guard. Now imagine, as a commander, as a general, or a man in the army, knowing that the Hessians might now know you're coming. The whole thing was the element of surprise. Washington didn't think they'd be expecting it, and now they may know. So does he go on? He decides to go on. Now, the myth of the story that some historians have written, and I've read other books that say this did not happen, was that the Hessians were drunk and partying and celebrating. People say that really wasn't true, that Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rall had his men on high alert, but he had actually frazzled them because he had them on such alert. Now, he had heard multiple warnings of a surprise attack, but Rall said this. Now, Rall's a good commander. He's very veteran experienced, and he's a good battlefield commander. But he was so confident of the superiority of his men and himself that he said this, let them come. So the guys, Washington and his men, emerged from the Trenton woods shortly after 8 a.m. He divided the wing into 3 columns and spearheaded the middle column. Guess who took the middle column? Himself. Washington again, placing him at the forefront of the fire. Again, never asking his men to do something he wouldn't do. And he took the fort in an exposed position, Chernow says, exposing himself to death, risking it all for this country, for your independence. Now, Chernow says Trenton consisted of 100 or so houses. Knox cannon began to fire with great accuracy to the 2 main streets, King and Queen Streets. Alexander Hamilton was there in the thick of the fray. Here's a quote, "The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump shall sound," said Knox. He forced the German gunners to abandon their weapons and scatter to the southern end of the town. Now, Colonel Rall was experienced. We knew that. So it could have been all over, but no. Colonel Rall had courage, and he mobilized a group of men in an apple orchard. Then tried to steer a charge toward Washington. Responding to this move, Washington adroitly positioned his men on high ground nearby. As John Greene would recall, General Washington, on horseback and alone, came up to our major and said, "March on, my brave fellows, after me." And he rode off. That's a leader. That's a great commander. Inspiring and rallying his men, making sure they were going to get the victory that day, was George Washington, never quitting, never giving up, marching on. Chernow says Washington's quick-witted action stopped the Hessian advance in its tracks. Colonel Rall was riddled with bullets, reeled in the saddle. He was taken to a church. Washington actually talked to him, and he said, "Treat the Hessians honorably." Washington was an honorable man as well. He wanted the Hessians treated honorably. Pretty good stuff, this man. A lot we can learn from Washington and how he treated other people. Major Wilkinson, that's the guy that was with him, I've read that primary source account, said this is a glorious day for our country, and it was. Chernow says this: since Washington had crafted the strategy and led his men to glory, the stunning victory belonged to Washington. The triumph, guess how long it took to do that? It was accomplished in less than an hour. George Trevelyan wrote, "Whether so small a number of men ever employed so short a space of time with greater and more lasting effects upon the history of the world." And that was true. In that hour, they changed the world. The battle toll was a bloody one for the Hessians. 22 killed, 84 wounded, and nearly 900 captured. Get that, 900 captured. Versus only 2 deaths in combat, plus another 4 or 5 from exposure for the Americans. Washington and his men changed the world that day. Resilience, courage, honor, all were there. The men had the resilience. Washington took risk. He didn't ask his men to do anything that he would not do. And I think there's a lot to learn from this. This battle changed the war for Americans. It raised the spirit. The newspapers wrote about it. Washington was a hero. It had been his victory and Americans' victory, and we needed a lift. We needed our spirits raised. But it was American spirit that won it, of those men. They showed what? Resilience, marching in the cold, no shoes. They showed courage. They took risk. Washington took a big risk it all, and it paid off. I think there was divine intervention involved. And at the end, it was one of the greatest American victories that changed the world. Frederick the Great said this after the Battle of Princeton, because right after this he wins the Battle of Princeton, which maybe we'll come back and do. Frederick the Great said this: "The achievements of Washington and his little band of compatriots between December 25th and the 4th of January, a space of 10 days, were the most brilliant of any recorded in the annals of military achievements." Pretty strong words. Thank you.